Hey guys, welcome back to Yanasa TV. I wanted to get back to the situation on East Palestine and answer some questions that people had on the channel the other day. And I think the important thing to remember about what's going on there is that nobody's a complete expert on the total fallout of what we're seeing. And in fact, I'm going to quote a few experts in the area who have studied chemical disasters like this, served on boards and in an official capacity. Gerald Pogé, Dr. Pogé, he was on the Chemical Safety Board, said the volume of chemicals is stupendous. He said it's horrific to think about how much was released and how much was purposefully burned. One issue, he said, with toxic chemical releases is that the hazards are posed not just by the individual chemicals involved, but chemical compounds can interact with one another in complex ways that persist after burning. So what he's saying is pretty serious. I mean, when you think about chemical reactions, et cetera, I mean, you have chemicals mixing as they're burned into the air, and nobody's really 100% sure of what that is going to look like. He said there could be hundreds of different unknown breakdown products that still remain, for which we have often very poor toxicological profiles. We're oftentimes in this unknown place. So this is coming from an expert, and I'm going to get into some of the statements that have come out from, the federal officials, governors in recent days, and how we should look at it, and then I'll give you my overall opinion on the farmlands in the surrounding counties. Donald Holstrom, a former director of the Western Regional Office of the United States Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, also said there's a lot of unknowns. And Eric D. Olson, the Senior Strategic Director for Health and Food of the Natural Resources Defense Council, said that with chemical spills, the threats to human can linger long after the emergency has been dealt with. Some of the authorities are telling people that when they return, they should open their windows and wipe down all their surfaces. Obviously, that means they know there's some contamination that remains in the area. The long-term effects are what often get overlooked, and that's coming from Dr. Olson. So, and I think that when you listen to some of these comments and some of the information that I put out there, you'll see how, there are concerns. Even when Governor DeWitt was asked at the town hall meeting, if he would be concerned about being in the area, he said yes.
I think that I would be drinking the bottled water, and I would be continuing to find out what the tests were showing as far as the air. I would be alert and concerned.
Now that's coming from somebody who probably knows more about the situation than anybody else. He's been there on ground zero since the beginning of this. And so has the EPA, and I've noticed that the EPA was quickly to brush off themselves as being, a backup support to the state of Ohio.
The state has the primacy and the lead. We are in support, in a support mode, and I don't think it was irresponsible. I think that we have deployed lots of assets.
They don't want to take credibility as being the front man, but a lot of the decisions that have been made per the state of Ohio have been based upon recommendations of the EPA. And I find it a little unnerving for the EPA to come in and say, oh, well, we're just here as a support role. The decisions being made are somebody else's, when they've been on the ground since the February 4th advising on what those decisions should be. There's been a very quick push-off. And I think there's some political games here, because you have a Republican governor and you have a Democratic president. So you have a Democrat, sorry, not Democratic, you have a Democrat president. And so you have the opportunities for some political fallout. And I think it's been happening on both sides there. I'm not taking one side over the other on this. But, the part of the reason why I think we should keep talking about the situation there is because before the media started paying attention to it, which took about a week for anybody to really notice, the dialogue was. I mean, if I were Norfolk Southern, I would almost have felt like, I was getting off a little easy on this whole thing. As dialogue has picked up and concerns have picked up, we've learned a lot of things about what's going on in the area, what's happening, the potential hazards of the area. 2 weeks after the incident started, they're finally putting a clinic out there for health concerns. There's just a lot of things that have moved forward and progressed from proper coverage of this particular topic. And I think that people on social media, as well as the news, should continue to cover this topic and put pressure on the system to right itself. Because when we don't talk about it, it's a lot easier for corners to be cut, for things to happen. And I feel like my sense of this is that at the beginning, that's what they were getting. Now they're actually having to answer to some of these questions and alleviate some of these concerns. And as we know, that some of these concerns, especially when I talk about some of this, are legitimate concerns. People should be, in my opinion, concerned. I am personally wondering, with the amount of people living in the area, the social media posts that I've been able to find dating back to that time frame, if there was some sort of disruption in services, whether there was reduced viewing or something of the area during that time, maybe a technical fallout. But why did it take us a week to really start seeing this hit the news? And even now, I can talk to people and they don't even know about it. Proper, clear, and concise communication is extremely important in something like this because you're dealing with toxic chemicals. You're seeing 3,500 fish of 12 different species die. Animals are getting sick. You have numerous different news agencies coming out with different information, different government officials, different specialists coming out with different information, different opinions. I've seen what I would call several different opinions coming out of the EPA. I mean, the EPA was the one who initially said back on February 8th that residents could return back to they're the ones who did the air quality tests that led to Governor DeWitt saying residents could safely return back to East Palestine. And as I get into this, you'll learn that the EPA doesn't even feel it's safe to return to East Palestine. But where you have somebody like Buttigieg out there telling people they have concise and accurate information, no, they do not. And when we look at how this information is coming across in bits and pieces and confused, it is very disturbing. They do not have accurate information. And I cannot go online and research and find accurate information. Now, USA Today, somebody should fry that publication. They've been putting out fact-checking, right, on this entire thing. And within 5 minutes, I can probably look at what they've fact-checked to be false statements to be accurate statements. For example, they talked about its impacts on wildlife and animals in the area other than aquatic species. They recognized the number of species because that came from a government official and how many fish have been impacted. But they kind of just glazed over the fact that people have taken their animals to a veterinary clinic. The veterinarians have diagnosed some of these animals with poisoning. They completely looked over that and just said that those reports were unreliable and therefore, in their opinion, it's false, that the air quality is fine. It tested fine back on February 8th. Ironically, an interview conducted by CNN, that does not seem to be the case. There is no definitive answer of how bad the pollutant is in the area, how far it has spread.
Can you give them any sort of a timeline when you believe you can say to them definitively, it's safe?
Erica, what I'd say is this is a fresh accident. We understand the community's angst. We are on the ground. We will conduct the cleanup. But we have to be able to get in and do the assessment. So as the conditions on the ground become safe so that we can put our scientists and engineers not in harm's way, but in a position where they could do their work, we will be then in a position to provide those updates to the public as soon as we can. We're going to keep the public updated. We have people on the ground now. And so we want to be transparent, Erica.
So a couple of other real quick questions before I lose you for timing here. You just said that as the conditions become safe, you'll send in your teams. Are there any areas at this point in time which you believe are still unsafe?
Well, it's an emergency response. And so obviously we want to be sure that we do not put anyone in harm's way, including our staff. So
is that a yes?
As we investigate and as we look at the site, we will determine when and how we can get the appropriate staff in to do the appropriate testing.
They also said that reports of pollutants drifting down the Ohio River were inaccurate or overstated because the clouds of pollutants were safe, that if they weren't safe, they wouldn't be allowing it into the drinking water systems, but they were able to filter it out. That's actually a false statement, USA Today. They actually, as the pollutants have been going down the Ohio River, there are reports that municipalities have been shutting down their water intakes from the Ohio River, which suggests that these pollutants, although I'm sure they are diluted, they probably get diluted as they go down the river. I mean, that's probably an accurate statement. They're still there, and they're still of concern. That's why they're watching the plume go down the river in the first place. And as the plume passes these municipal intakes, they are shutting off their intake water supply to keep those pollutants from going into their municipal water systems. Now, how that impacts other systems, I don't know. One thing is for sure, I would not go fishing on the Ohio River for a very long time, especially seeing the impacts that it had on fish in the waterways. Just because we're not seeing immediate impacts on fish in the Ohio River does not mean that there aren't going to be long-term impacts. The fact is that it's not trustworthy enough for them not to shut down the intakes of municipal water systems as the plume floats downriver at a mile an hour. There were reports from CBS News that it was safe to drink water. The actual water that they were referencing was municipal water, which is water that comes from a treatment facility by the city of East Palestine, or county, however their water system works out there. But it was not pertaining to well water, it was not pertaining to surface water, and even with them saying we've tested the water and it came out clean, both Governor DeWitt and the EPA Administrator suggested to residents that they remain on bottled water until further testing could be done.
Use bottled water.
I think that I would be drinking the bottled water.
And I agree with the governor's assessment. Remain on bottled water until those tests are complete.
Those are important points. They weren't discriminating against what type of water you could or could not drink. They were just saying, drink bottled water. And Norfolk Southern Railroad has been supplying bottled water to residents. I don't know if it's a bottle per resident or how that works. They seem to be a little cheap in this, in my opinion. But the point is that there are resources for some bottled water. The state officials have said, drink the bottled water until we're able, and the federal officials have said to drink the bottled water. So when I read some of these reports on the Ohio River, just to give you an idea of how far this plume has traveled, the initial reports I had read were that it was in Huntsville, West Virginia, Huntsville is a historic name for an area of West Virginia, about 180 miles from East Palestine. So this plume they were watching at that point in time, still observing, was still moving down the river 180 miles away from the site. It doesn't surprise me that a town 60 miles from the site actually tested positive for some of the chemicals in that water. The chemicals in that water supposedly aren't as bad as some of the chemicals that they burned, but they definitely tested positive 60 miles away from East Palestine. This chemical blob, as it floated down the river over 180 miles, now it's actually gone even further because it's been several days. It's probably gone another 80 miles since the story that I was reading. They have been shutting off those municipality intakes out of precaution of this non-toxic diluted bloom. But even with that situation, even with the visible bloom, what concerns me the most and concerns me with agriculture, not just animals and air quality, but just the overall toxins that have seeped into the soil and the stream beds and the river beds.
We also heard a gentleman, and you may have heard him just before we came to you, who said he wouldn't plant anything in the ground for at least a year. He's very concerned about soil contamination. So I've spent some time on the local Ohio EPA website there looking at what's being put up by the on-site contamination folks. I am not finding in my search information on soil testing. Is the soil being tested?
And it seems to me that it's what we can't see that should concern us the most in this situation. I mean, we know that this ash was going up in the air. We know from chemical experts that all sorts of things could happen when these things are burnt and sent up in the air. J.D. Vance, which is one of the two senators of the state of Ohio, actually went out just on February 16th, about a day or so ago, and he was showing what looked like a clear stream bed until he stuck his stick that he was holding into it and stirred up the bottom.
Hey guys, so I'm here at Leslie Run, and there's dead worms and dead fish all throughout this water. So, something I just discovered is that if you scrape the creek bed, it's like chemical is coming out of the ground. Can you come here? And let me just show this to people. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this on the camera, but watch this. Just see that chemical pop out of the creek. This is disgusting.
Now, it's not unusual to take a stick and stir up the bottom of a creek or a pond and see some rainbow colors coming up, but the extent to which this coloring was coming up, it was pretty obvious that there were chemicals in the base of that stream and in the soil underneath the stream bed that were being stirred up. Chemicals and other particles could float down and settle in the bottom of that stream, so pumping out water, filtering it, pumping it back in, may not completely filter out all those chemicals. I don't know how they clean up this mess. I mean, that's a bit concerning to me. I don't know how you clean this entire thing up. But what I do know is that what he showed on his little video the other day was concerning, and what makes it even more concerning is thinking about how much of that is in the soil, in the ground, and the grasses that are throughout the area. You know, East Palestine is located in a county. All the counties around it are pretty significant when it comes to agriculture. But East Palestine is a community of over 1,000 farms. And when you think about the impacts that could have on the soil, how long those contaminants could be there, this is where it becomes a little bit alarming, especially for somebody who covers agriculture. You know, what do we do here? Do we have answers for this yet? According to the EPA Administrator, what's his name again? Michael Reagan. CNN asked Michael Reagan about planting tomatoes. She said that they had interviewed somebody on there who said, I wouldn't even plant a tomato for the next year. Michael Reagan's response should be alarming to most of you. Michael Reagan responded that he would not do any of those activities until they've been able to do further testing.
This morning, what would you say to that gentleman who told us, I wouldn't plant tomatoes for the next year? Would you advise that he do any planting this spring?
You know, Eric, I'd be realistic. This is a fresh site of a disaster. And as we go in, as we assess, and as we clean up, we want the public to know that when we know, they will know. So obviously, I would not take any immediate action on a fresh site until the government has the opportunity to go in, invest, and clean it up to the appropriate level so that we can ensure public health is protected and lives are protected.
Now, this conversation went on from there because the CNN anchor wanted to know when they could expect those final test results. And what Michael Reagan continued to say after that point should be alarming to anybody who has returned to East Palestine. And that is that he said, when we feel it is safe to get our teams in there to conduct the testing, until we can do that, we can't start the testing to determine, what we're actually dealing with. So this is the EPA Administrator basically in a very well-tuned dialogue explaining to CNN that he does not have the answers and that they won't have the answers until they deem it safe for their own team to enter. She asked him to clarify what he meant on that. He just summarized it up as saying, when we're able to perform the tests, we'll let everybody know.
So I understand this is ongoing, and I know that you understand for the folks on the ground, they get that, but they also need real answers. This has been a really difficult 2 weeks for them. Do you have any sense, given that in your words, this is an ongoing cleanup, can you give them any sort of a timeline when you believe you can say to them definitively, it's safe?
You know, Erica, what I'd say is this is a fresh accident. We understand the community's angst. We are on the ground. We will conduct the cleanup, but we have to be able to get in and do the assessment. So as the conditions on the ground become safe so that we can put our scientists and engineers not in harm's way, but in a position where they could do their work, we will be then in a position to provide those updates to the public as soon as we can. You know, we're going to keep the public updated. We have people on the ground now. And so we want to be transparent, Erica.
So a couple of other real quick questions before I lose you for timing here. You just said that as the conditions become safe, you'll send in your teams. Are there any areas at this point in time which you believe are still unsafe?
Well, you know, it's an emergency response. And so obviously we want to be sure that we do not put anyone in harm's way, including our staff. So as we investigate, as we investigate and as we look at the site, we will determine when and how we can get the appropriate staff in to do the appropriate testing.
That tells you that the EPA Administrator himself is concerned about the conditions of the area and that they still have a lot of unknown answers. So when agencies are putting out these reports that the EPA is saying it is safe, I don't actually think that he was saying it's safe at all. I think he was deflecting a lot of those comments. And if anything, he flat out said they don't have all the answers yet. The only answer he had was that's government at work.
You know, we should be able to give an answer. What you're seeing is a government in action.
Good job, Michael. Now, a crop scientist at Cornell University, I believe his name is Michael McBride. Yep, Michael McBride, I got that one right. Michael McBride said, it's unclear how much of this volatile chemical escaped into the air or burned before entering surface waters and soil. But vinyl chloride is highly mobile in soils and water and can persist for years. Farmers should test soils and water prior to planting. So he's kind of saying what the EPA guy said, don't do anything until you've been able to run proper tests. And he's also warning that this situation could persist for years. He was suggesting to continue testing for the next several months because, as he said, this can remain pretty mobile in these environments. The chemical can still be present, and it could take a considerable amount of time for the chemical to deplete and it be safe to plant food that consumers are then going to eat. I hope more attention is brought to this subject. I hope that we don't see things progressing and this type of thing enter into our food supply. When they say our food supply is safe, it's currently safe because we're not planting. But clearly from experts in the fields, they don't feel that it is safe. A EPA administrator said he would not plant a tomato. So let's get into some of the farm stats and potential economic impacts that I think we could see issues with in Ohio. Now, Steubenville is the town that tested positive for some of the contaminants in the water supply about 60 miles from East Palestine. Steubenville is in Jefferson County, which has 599 farms on over 76,000 acres. Carroll County, which is another county I think could be affected, has 888 farms on over 110,000 acres. In Columbiana County, where the incident actually occurred, has 1,122 farms on over 142,000 acres. So to put that into dollars for you, Columbiana County produces about $107 million worth of agricultural goods each year. Jefferson, $9.2 million. Carroll, $49 million. Now, in recent days, the state of Pennsylvania has expressed some extreme concerns over this. The governor feels as though there were alternative methods to controlling the potential massive chemical bomb that could have blown up that they were concerned with. He feels that the EPA made some bad choices, made some bad decisions. He feels that the rail lines was acting without taking into consideration multiple agencies, their opinions and what they felt could happen. Now, maybe it does sound like this could have blown up into an uncontrolled situation. So maybe Norfolk was just trying to cut their losses at that point in time. I don't know. But if you watch where this plume went, it actually went into Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania governor, 2 weeks after the fact, has finally said, okay, you know what, we're going to do our own testing. We want to know what's going on ourselves because we're unsure about the safety of this situation. We don't necessarily agree with what we're being told. So here's another government official questioning what's going on. He's questioning it because the public has become aware of what happened. The public has started to speak up. It's making these people go back and relook at this situation and say, oh crud, this is actually worse than what we were maybe initially told, maybe what we were initially expected to believe. So he is conducting some tests. Now, there's 3 counties that I think are close enough to the site in Pennsylvania and within where that initial plume was coming of high concentration that could be impacted. There's Beaver County, which has about 613 farms on 53,000 acres. They produce about $23 million a year in agricultural products. Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, which is right there. Unfortunately, the two counties that had a direct hit from this thing probably have the largest number of farms. They have Lawrence County has 587 farms on 82,000 acres. They produce about $34 million a year. There's a third county there I've misplaced my notes on, but it was a significant number of farms and acreage that could be impacted from this. And I think it's important that farmers realize in that area that a lot of these government officials, a lot of chemical scientists, a lot of soil scientists are concerned about planting in the conditions with the amount of information that we have. It's been very troublesome to me that we've seen so much information go back and forth. You know, on February 8th, they're saying it's okay for residents to return. On February, 14th, Governor DeWitt is saying, yes, I would be concerned about living in this area. And on February 16th, you have the EPA Administrator saying we haven't sent in all our crews because we consider this an active, fresh situation, or a fresh and active situation, meaning that they don't think that it's completely safe for their crews to be in the area. The other thing that I find troubling is, you know, we'll spend trillions of dollars a year on a lot of projects. And when FEMA was first approached about this, and I want you to understand what FEMA is, because their response to Ohio was, in my opinion, priceless. But FEMA, you know, is an organization that if a hurricane hits an island full of vacation homes, will pay out billions of dollars to make repairs, put those vacation homes back together. And ironically, you know, when we saw the hurricane catastrophes down in Florida, they were extremely slow to respond there. Governor DeSantis actually had to go out and build an entire bridge going to Sanibel Island before he could get federal action on what had happened down there. I mean, he was quick to respond. They were extremely slow. And this is another case where they've been slow to respond. And I think that this is a political issue. And this is where I hate this two-party system, is because we end up playing politics in a way that hurts people. It damages people. It hurts people. But FEMA denied Ohio assistance initially, stating that because it wasn't a natural disaster and there was a private company that could be held responsible for the cleanup, that they would not get involved. Now, the problem that I see with this is we have a highly toxic situation involving multiple states, involving citizens of our country. It is a health and safety concern, a national security concern, a food safety concern of growing food, agricultural concerns. And I realized that there were multiple agencies on the ground that were taking a back seat, that don't want to take responsibility for the chemical burn. But FEMA should have been there first and foremost. FEMA should be in there coordinating how to handle the response to this event. I think that the government serves a role to protect the sovereignty of our country. And honestly, that's about all I think that they should be doing, but that's my personal opinion. And they failed. The current administration failed in that capacity, not coming in there for 2 weeks with their largest organization for emergency management for all hazards. That's my tidbit on that. I think that this situation has probably gotten worse than it should have been. I think that if there were more heads whirling at this at the very beginning, more pressure on the White House to get involved at the very beginning, this contamination could have been substantially reduced in some sort of way or capacity if there were more people involved. So to answer the overall question, do I think it's going to impact agriculture? I do. You have to remember, though, that several $100 million in agricultural goods is not a significant number when it comes to the overall amount of agriculture that our country produces. But when you're talking about several thousand farms, and you think about what that means when those farms go out of business, when they're not able to plant, what kind of assurances are they going to have when they go to plant and plants don't grow? Are they going to be able to collect on disasters? And what about the small farms? The small farms, as you learned from our bird flu video, they really don't benefit from a lot of these big programs. They don't necessarily have the same insurances. They can't afford them because the way the insurance works is it's created for the big commercial producer. It's not created for the small producer. And so I think that you could see some fallout from this if they continue with testing, and in doing so, they determine that the soils are unsafe. And based on the level of contamination that we've all seen, based on the level of toxins we've all seen, based on some of the comments from the experts on this subject matter that I read at the beginning of this video, I do think that we're going to see some sort of impact hitting at least part of all of the counties that I mentioned there, if not more. I mean, depending on the fallout, they were talking about, there were reports of ash falling on cars in New Hampshire. And I realize that the initial federal position on this one was that they didn't trace any contaminants up there. They believe it went north into Canada. But the fact is that there was ash and dust on people's vehicles. And I doubt it came from a fire in California this time. If these particles and contamination are in areas that we're choosing not to test just because we're wanting to lessen the situation, that could impact anybody who buys those products. If we choose to test and we find contamination and a safety issue, then it can affect all of those farmers. Now, luckily, there is a buyer. Bill Gates is looking for some cheap farmland, and so I'm sure that you will be able to get pennies on the dollar for something out there. But that's a joke, y'all, kind of. But my point is that there are some risks there. And the official opinion coming from the EPA Administrator himself is, we haven't gotten all the answers yet. We don't know if it's safe to or not. I wouldn't do any of the activities we would normally like to do until we have answers to that.
We will be able to inform the public as to when it's safe for some of these various activities that they'd like to pursue. This is fresh, and we understand everyone's concern, but we're with the community.
Right. So to that point, in that you'll let people know when they can resume some of the activities, as you point out. This morning, what would you say to that gentleman who told us, I wouldn't plant tomatoes for the next year? Would you advise that he do any planting this spring?
Eric, I'd be realistic. This is a fresh site of a disaster. And as we go in, as we assess, and as we clean up, we want the public to know that when we know, they will know. So obviously, I would not take any immediate action on a fresh site.
Anyway, be safe and keep the dialogue of what's going on out there going until we have definitive answers. And without the pressure, FEMA is finally going in there because of the pressure of people like you who have watched this stuff, who have reached out to, the current administration and said, what the heck are you doing? And because of that, Governor DeWitt was finally able, after several weeks, to get the support of FEMA. I mean, these are the types of things where you don't realize the impact you have as a citizen until you actually take a step to open your mouth and say something. And I realize that sometimes it feels like we can be attacked for doing that. I think that's wrong. But if we just shut up altogether and we no longer speak up, then areas like East Palestine would be chemical bombs that are getting buried in a bunch of paperwork that we never know about, and we don't understand the potential risks that could fall out from that. And as we know from previous disasters in our country, those initial reports are untrustworthy. Further investigation is required to fully understand the impacts of this.